It's a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Zach Edey could be an all-star. That is what his former college coach is saying. Plus, Jaren Jackson Jr. officially switches numbers, and we have a birthday to celebrate. Happy birthday, Big 12. Call 12 on his birthday. Ja Morant is now 26. All that and more on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for being with me on this Monday edition of the podcast. It is I, Joe Mullinax, flying solo once more. DeMichael Cole had a busy weekend. He was covering golf there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's got to recover. There's a lot of walking in golf. He got a lot of steps in. Happy to give DeMichael the day and happy to be here with you for another installment of Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. As proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Google. Literally anywhere you get a podcast, you can get Locked On Grizzlies. Become a part of our every day or every episode here in the dog days of the NBA offseason. NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every time an episode drops. Again, anywhere you get podcasts, you can make DeMichael and I a part of your NBA Memphis Grizzlies experience. And I got to be honest with you, leading off, coming in hot this week, this dog days episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I was doing some research for the show, as one tends to do in these lean times for NBA content discussion. And I'm gonna level with you here. I got distracted by my mom's birthday. Shout out to my mom. Mom's birthday is today. Happy birthday, Mama Mullinax. And as I was going through and, trying to think of a nice thing to send to her, say to her, that sort of stuff, celebrate her birthday, celebrate her, right? It's mom. Got to live it up for mom. Something came across my feed, and I'm not quite sure how the algorithm connected my mother to Matt Painter, but it most certainly did. And for those of you that don't know who Matt Painter is the head coach of the Purdue Boilermakers. Matt Painter was the head coach of Memphis Grizzlies big man Zach Edey while he was in college. And Matt Painter said something that I found very interesting. Now, it's important to understand that Matt Painter and Zach Edey have a very strong relationship. They're very connected. Painter views Edey as one of the most important players in the history of Purdue basketball. And I think that's a fair thing to say because, again, we got to remember, Edey was one of the most dominant players in the history of college basketball during his final 2 seasons at Purdue. He won the National Player of the Year award in 2023 and in 2024. And this is from an article written by Dustin Shute that you can find on MSN, SI, all sorts of different places. So shout out to Dustin for the story. And the story comes from an interview that Coach Matt Painter did with old friend of mine, back to my ESPN 92.9 days, Gary Parrish, who has the Eye on College Basketball podcast for CBS Sports. So ipso facto, Dustin writes the article about the video interview that Gary Parrish does with Matt Painter. And Painter said, and I quote from the article and the interview, "I think he's going to grow into an offensive role over time. They'll learn to trust him a little bit more. I understand it's not a post-up league anymore, but there are advantages in getting into the bonus, getting to the free throw line. Once he starts to get that respect as a player in the league, I think they'll get him more calls. They'll see a pattern. Those guys don't want to battle with him. They don't want to take that on all the time, and he's very comfortable with that." Edey could be an all-star in the eyes of Coach Painter because in the right scenario, as Painter said, he can be an all-star. You saw it at the end of the season. He had some of those monster rebounding games. He can consistently do that. I know that. Whatever you want him to do, you just have to talk him through it. He's cool. He just wants to win. True, and I do think that a really important note there from Coach Painter is this concept of Edey getting a bad rep, right? Whether it is Kristen Peak during the draft process saying it was one of the worst draft picks in the history of the NBA draft, which was obviously ridiculous when it was said. Or my good buddy Matt Moore at HP Basketball does terrific work with Locked On NBA, Locked On Nuggets. Matt likes to make fun and poke and prod at Edey being a big lumber. He kind of sees them as this giant player that your eyes and the numbers don't necessarily say that he is. And again, this is from Coach Painter. He changes ends better than you think. He's a better defensive player than you think. I think he can be an elite rebounder. I think he can score more than he's shown so far, but he's fitting in with the winning pieces in Memphis, and that's what you have to do. I do see a road, a path to Zach Edey being an all-star. Now, I do want to stress, before people get in the comments or hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax and say that I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, it's one of those things that everything has to go exactly right. I think that there has to be heightened opportunity for Zach. I do believe this season is a good example of that. We've talked a lot about Gigi Jackson being in the mix for that fifth starter role because of the lack of offensive scoring. If you go with KCP and Jalen Wells, Edey could pick up a little bit of that offensive load, especially since Jaren Jackson Jr., who we'll talk more about later on in the show, is such a perimeter-based big. Could Edey be the third man offensively? Maybe. And we know that the Grizzlies historically love to zag while the rest of the league zigs. Coach Painter is right. This is not a traditional post-up league anymore, but is there room? Are we thinking about this wrong? Is there room for Edey to be the guy that benefits most from this lack of perimeter scoring with the starting five potentially if it's Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Jalen Wells? Maybe. I see a lane there. I don't know that that is the best way for the Grizzlies to win basketball games in the here and now, but I do think that a larger role in the offense for Zach Edey makes sense, especially when you consider that so much from what we know about Tomas Isolo and the scheme that he is likely to put in as the new Grizzlies head coach, so much of it is going to be pick and roll dependent. So much of it is going to be based off of that initial screen set by the 7'4", almost 300-pound Edey once he comes back from his ankle surgery and injury. And with that being that key point to initiate so many different looks within the scheme, Edey as a roll man, you could see a lot more often. Edey flashing to the opposite post off of dribble penetration, maybe a quick kick to the corner, somebody closes out and they feed Edey underneath for a quick underneath bucket. There are so many different ways that you can get Zach Edey involved in the concepts. And I agree completely with the rebounding piece. Completely agree. We have not seen the full possibilities of a big like Zach Edey, 7'4", 290 to 300 pounds as a rebounder. We've seen Zach Edey defend the rim pretty well, 2.9% block percentage this past season, 84 percentile among bigs in the NBA. That's pretty darn good. We've seen him rebound elite in stretches, right? Especially after the Taylor Jenkins firing, Isolo becomes the interim head coach. Edey got more opportunity in situations where he was going to be able to flourish. He wasn't being asked to be a pop-out big to shoot threes. All the more greater evidence that if Taylor Jenkins had his druthers, Zach Edey probably wouldn't have been the pick at 9. A disconnect between the front office and the coaching staff, at least to my eyes. No inside sources there. It's just the way Edey was utilized did not align with where the organization clearly prioritized him in their lottery drafting. So him having this new opportunity, the firing of Jenkins and the hiring of Isolo, you can make an argument, has almost as much to do with how to get the most out of Zach Edey as it does with getting the most out of the birthday boy that we'll talk about later, Ja Morant. Could Edey be an all-star in this setup? I think it's possible. I think he's going to put up the rebounding numbers that are going to make eyes pop. They're really going to allow for him to dominate that space. No one really to compete with. And Lord knows he's going to be the biggest man almost every single night on the floor. So if he has that capacity in his 26, 28, 30 minutes of play to be that glass eater, to be that elite rebounder, to average a double-double, block a couple shots a game, maybe that's not quite all-star caliber production in his sophomore season, but it's certainly a leap forward that aligns with what our eyes and the numbers told us, the change happening at head coach, with the change happening at head coach. So I think Coach Painter is supporting one of his guys, and he got to as a coach. I get it. He's got his heart out for his dude. And shout out to Gary Parrish for the great interview with Coach Painter. But I do think there's a very narrow lane. Zach Edey, the all-star, I see the vision, especially under this new Isolo era. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments. Hit me up on X. Do you agree or disagree? Could Zach Edey be an all-star in the NBA? Kind of feels like the opposite end of the spectrum. This time last year, we were talking about, is he really going to be the worst pick ever? Now we're saying, could he be an all-star? Do you think their truth is in the middle there? Let us know in the comments. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to continue our conversation. Another major change, not just in terms of perspective of Zach Edey with a new coaching staff, a new number for one Jaren Jackson Jr. Stick around here on Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks over at Gametime. We've all been there, logging on early, waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show that you have been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Gametime comes in. Gametime makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever before. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. Have you ever wondered what the view will actually be like from your seat before you buy? The app shows you a panoramic seat view, so there are no surprises. Make sure you are checking out Gametime. Take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So Jaren Jackson Jr., as most players do nowadays, he announced on social media via his own social media, and there are already rumblings of this number change occurring, right, from other spaces and places. But he formally introduced himself as Jaren Jackson Jr. number 8. This 8th number, or this number 8 situation in Jaren's upcoming 8th NBA season. And sometimes, because Jaren is not even 26 years old yet, just entering his prime, we forget that Jaren is a veteran by most accounts in the NBA. If he had entered the league at a time that used to be normal, right? If you were a college senior, 22, 23 years old, he would be in his early 30s by now. But this is a 26-year-old guy just entering his prime that has just signed a multi-year, near-max contract extension with the Memphis Grizzlies. He is in the plans for the foreseeable future, and he comes out and he announces this change to kind of coincide and align with the deal. And the cool thing about this for me, and you know, I talked about my mom in the first segment. My dad is a lot of the reason that I do what I do, and my grandfather too. And my love of football, sports in general, comes from my dad and my grandfather. So Jaren, on his Instagram, whatever social media he shared the video on, talked about how going back and looking at where he came from and his inspiration for why he does what he does, and it brought him back to his dad. And his dad, of course, a former member of the San Antonio Spurs. This is a guy who did some phenomenal work while he was in the league. Certainly not the same kind of player as Jaren, his son, of course, but spent a majority of his season, or he was kind of a journeyman in the league, but he spent a majority of his career, the most time in his career, with the San Antonio Spurs. And Jaren Sr., really kind of refocusing on the number 8, one of the numbers that his dad wore. I think that there is a lot to be said for how he just wants to get to a place where he can focus on the game of basketball. It's no longer about having to worry about the money. It's no longer about having to worry about long-term security. That has been established, right? And we've talked about here on the podcast before how Jaren was on a very team-friendly deal on this last contract. It was descending in value. Wasn't quite the Steph Curry contract from several years ago that enabled the team to bring in Kevin Durant, that sort of stuff, because of the bum ankles that everybody thought Steph had. Wasn't quite that, but it was still a very team-friendly deal. There were foul trouble concerns. Jaren outgrew the contract pretty early on in the deal. Now, as a near-max contract player, the value is there, right? That is what Jaren Jackson Jr. is in the NBA. As I mentioned on our last episode of the show, I have him number 20 in the league. Surely that's going to be roughly where he winds up in our voting as the Locked On NBA Top 100 goes live over the next several days. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that down the road. There's a decent chance he's ranked in front of Ja Morant, which I talked about on the last episode why I didn't do that, but I could certainly see why my compatriots here at Locked On NBA may do such a thing. I think that this is Jaren acknowledging, and again, he showed clips with him and his dad in the video and that sort of thing. This is Jaren acknowledging it started with basketball, right? And this is a Renaissance man. This is a guy that's very active in the Players Association. He has, he's rapped. He has rap albums that come out. He's very into fashion and art, all sorts of different stuff. He is very cultured. But at the end of the day, he's not making roughly $250 million over the life of this contract coming up to be an art aficionado or to be a fashion genius or to be a multi-platinum rapper. He is getting this because he is a basketball player first and foremost. And it feels like a reintroduction of sorts to what Jaren can be. And what can Jaren be? I mean, we've talked about it before. I see him as a Giannis light. Taylor Jenkins saw him as that when he got the job back in 2019. He talked about it then. And even under Isolo, I think that you can still have a lane, a wider lane than Zach Edey, the all-star, to Jaren, the all-NBA player that can be that Giannis light type of player. I don't think he's ever going to be as good as Giannis. But I do see the possibility for Jaren to grow his game at 26 years old to a place where he is a legitimate all-NBA contender. He's already there now, you could argue. But to jump up in front of a few other guys that are currently in front of him. There's layers to this. If Zach Edey's going to be an all-star, Jaren's going to have to do a lot of the same stuff in order to be a firm all-NBA player. He has to rebound better. Now, Edey is always going to be a better rebounder. I think Jaren is what he is on the rebounding end. He's never going to be the glass grabber that people want him to be, especially folks on our wonderful YouTube comments. But I do think that Jaren can find space to grow his game there. I think that Jaren has to grow as a passer. I've talked about that a ton, ad nauseum. Probably to the point that people get annoyed with me. But that is important. He has to be capable of doing this as a facilitator of offense because he's going to generate so much attention. Zach Edey was terrible at it this past season in terms of passing the basketball. Zach Edey was a 5.8%. That was 8th percentile among bigs. You know where Jaren Jackson Jr. stood? 10.3%. Certainly better, almost double what Edey was doing, but that's still average to below average among big men in the NBA. That has to be higher. And the frustrating part is it was higher. In the 2023-2024 season, Jaren was at 13.3%. That was above average for NBA bigs. I'm not asking Jaren Jackson Jr. to be a point guard. I'm asking him to get his head up out of these double teams when he dribbles into them and find the open man and make the smart pass. Make the right choice with the ball in your hands. Jaren has to be that guy. And Jaren has to be able to defend without fouling. He was an all-NBA defensive team member with a little bit of a return to the foul-prone issues. But those have been overblown a bit by media. Jaren was terrible at it early in his career. At his worst, he was at 6.4%. That was his third season in the NBA. He wasn't able to stay on the court. But he was at 4.2% this past year. It's not good, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Still room for growth there. Staying on the court has to be a priority for a guy that the team has clearly decided to invest in. The Grizzlies chose Jaren Jackson Jr. over Desmond Bane. The Grizzlies chose Ja Morant over Desmond Bane. And if you're evaluating it from a strictly basketball ceiling potential, those two were the right choices. Jaren Jackson Jr. has a much higher ceiling than Desmond Bane. I mentioned how Jaren is entering his 8th NBA season, and he is 26 years old. Desmond Bane is 27 years old and is entering his 6th NBA season. So Jaren has 2 more NBA seasons than Dez. Dez is a year older than Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja Morant. So the Grizzlies went with upside. They went with raw talent. They went with the physicality aspect in both Ja and Jaren over Dez. Dez, you could argue, has the most basketball skill of those three if you consider shooting a primary skill, which you probably should in 2025. But Jaren is the two-way stalwart. Jaren is the guy who is entering that prime at 6'11", 245 pounds, and can still add layers to his game. How does he get to that place? How does he find that energy, find that motivation to take his game to the next level. Maybe it's in turning to his dad and remembering what got him to this place to begin with. I'm excited about Jaren's number 8. I might even cop a jersey. Is that what the kids still say? Cop a jersey? Might pick one of those up. Let me know in the comments. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. How are you feeling about Jaren's number change? Pretty rare for somebody entering their 8th NBA season to make such a drastic move from number 13 for Jaren to number 8. Let me know how you're feeling about it in the comments or on X. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to close out this episode of the show talking about the birthday boy, Ja Morant. Jaren is almost 26 years old. Ja Morant recently turned it. Let's talk about his maturation process coming up next year on the show. Stick around. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, closing out this episode of the podcast with you on this wonderful Monday. Thank you for being with me again. To Michael Cole, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal, was doubling as a golf beat writer over the last few days. Taking a breather from that, he'll be back with us later this week. We still need to talk more about the NBA Top 100. I want to hear what DeMichael did with his ballot. We'll check in, see if some of those numbers are being released, and lots of different angles we can take with that and more as we continue our August Dog Days journey here on Locked On Grizzlies. So again, remember, out of respect for our audience, it's not going to be every day. It'll be every couple of days, 3 to 4 episodes a week that will drop. Stay patient with us here as training camp approaches in the next month or so. We'll have more to discuss. But again, trying to be respectful of our wonderful everydayers. We'll see you the next time an episode drops, not necessarily tomorrow. Ja Morant, looking forward to his 26th year, hopefully being his best year in the National Basketball Association. And obviously, this is not a perfect science, right? Talked about my mom. Ja and my mom, close in terms of birthdays. My mom much older than Ja. And I do believe that there's different maturation levels as you get older, right? There was a time when I was younger that I would have relished having a house to myself where I could do what I wanted, eat what I want, not have to worry about being around other people. It's just me to worry about. I would have loved that, maybe 20 years ago. Now, as a middle-aged man with a wife and 3 kids, when they're not around, I miss them terribly. And I wish they would come back as soon as possible. That's part of getting older, right? That's part of growing as a person, realizing it's who you share the life with, not the things that you do, or having the choice to control every aspect of your decision-making. It's about who you share that stuff with. And from a basketball standpoint, I think that this season is going to be a fascinating one for the newly minted 26-year-old Ja Morant. On the court, it's about staying on the court, right? Availability being the greatest ability for Ja. Ja has only played 67 games, or more than the league mandated 65 games in order to be considered for postseason awards now. He's only done that one time. He played 63 games in his sophomore season. He hasn't played more than 59 games since 2020-2021. So just being on the court for an extended period of time is going to be a huge victory for Ja. We've talked a lot about that. But Ja is also going to be asked to carry so much more of the scoring burden than he's been asked to do before. And that doesn't mean he can't do it. DeMichael has talked about that on here before, right? Ja says all the time he could score more. Well, we're about to find out if it goes the way that DeMichael and I somewhat predict. Still some time. But when the team is healthy, if it is Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Jalen Wells, Ja Morant is the offensive engine. Jaren is a close second. But Ja is the guy that's going to stir the drink. The screens are going to be designed to get him free and loose to be able to make a read. The backdoor cuts are going to be off of his dribble penetration. His vision is going to be dependent on not just to see the right play for his teammates, but to see the right play to score the ball himself more often than he has in recent years. Does he have the capacity to be able to take on that responsibility, to take on that scoring load in addition to all of the other things that he's asked to do? It's not like his usage is low, right? And again, usage rate, how much of the team's offense did the player use by shooting, turning the ball over, or assisting? Ja was at 34.7% this past season. That is 92nd percentile among NBA point guards. That is in the top 10%. But guess what? 2 years ago, Ja was in the 98th percentile at 38%. I think we're going to be getting back up to that, if not higher. And it's going to be necessary for the Grizzlies to be able to score the ball. He has to make the choice to be that initiator, not just of offense for others, but also for himself. And he needs to do it earlier in games. The off-the-court stuff, we've heard enough about that. The suspension is long in the past. All the things that maybe would have been distractions, it seems that he's refocused. We've talked recently about how Nike clearly isn't that concerned because Nike has made the choice to invest in Ja Morant and stick with that investment. But can Ja be the leader that this team needs him to be? So Michael and I have talked about one of the underrated pieces of this Desmond Bane trade is in a lot of the basketball-specific spaces, he was the captain. Jaren Jackson Jr. was a great overall representative in the community, and obviously Jaren has a major important basketball role to play. But it was Dez that was getting in Santi Aldama's face about defense. It was Dez that was so much of that energy in terms of execution and making sure that things were going in the right direction for the Grizzlies on the court. Can Ja Morant take up some of that mantle? Can he be that leader in the locker room? Is he invested enough in his teammates to be able to take the time to nurture and develop relationships so that they feel comfortable around him and seeing him as that main focal point leader? It's very possible they do. But you have Cedric Howard, who's new to the team. You have Ty Jerome, who's new to the team. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who is new to the team. If you want to subscribe to the idea that this isn't a rebuild, this is a retool, there's still some pretty significant changes that need to be addressed in terms of Ja finding out how those guys like the ball. Ja spending the time to develop relationships with them so that it's not just all business. Yes, the NBA is a business. The money comes first and foremost for just about everybody. But they're still playing a game, a child's game. There's still a level of competition to this that goes all the way back to when they were kids playing on a blacktop somewhere across the country or the continent in the case of Zach Edey. There are spaces and places where Ja Morant's age of 26 now has to correspond to growth in terms of maturity. And it happens for all of us at different levels. I gave my example of enjoying being alone. Ja is not alone. He is responsible for a lot of the basketball productivity of an entire NBA franchise. It is his show. He is the max contract guy. It is time for him to, A, be able to stay on the floor, and B, be the leader that this Memphis Grizzlies team needs him to be. He doesn't need to be Desmond Bane. He needs to be an older and wiser Ja Morant. And hey, we're a step closer to the older part. Happy birthday to Ja. Looking forward to a major season from him. I believe it's going to be the best season of Ja's career, and we'll talk all the different ways of how that can come to pass as we continue in our journey that is known as Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for being with me on this edition of the podcast, and thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there is no offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure you're hitting me up and letting me know how you feel about Zach Edey, the All-Star. Do you agree that there's a very narrow lane to that happening? But it's possible. Elite rebounding, growing as a passer, developing offensive role in Isolo's new scheme. How do you feel about that? Do you like Jaren Jackson Jr.'s out of character, at least for guys entering their 8th NBA season, number change? How do you feel about Ja Morant taking on a larger, more mature role in the organization with the departure of Desmond Bane? Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, wherever you get podcasts. Make sure that you are making us a part each and every time an episode drops of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. Make sure you're following me on X at Joe Mullinax, and make sure you are back with us next time there is an episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am so grateful that you joined me for this installment of the show. I hope you'll be back next time. Until next time, have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll catch you soon here on Locked On Grizzlies. See ya.